The story of Abigail is not just a tale from antiquity, but an eternal lesson on the power of wisdom and courage to change the course of events. What would you do if someone's foolishness put your life and that of your entire community at risk? And what if you found yourself face to face with a future king, blinded by anger and ready to take vengeance into his own hands? This was the challenge that Abigail faced. With humility, intelligence, and unwavering faith, her words not only prevented a bloodbath, but also left an indelible mark on history. If you want to learn how this exceptional woman achieved the unthinkable and what we can learn from her example, stay with us until the end. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories and share this video with those who may find in Abigail a source of strength and wisdom. Now, get ready to dive into a story that will challenge your perspective on life and true greatness. In a rugged and mountainous land, in the heart of Maon, lived a woman whose name would become synonymous with prudence and virtue, Abigail. Her physical beauty was remarkable, but what truly set her apart was the nobility of her spirit. In an era of uncertainty and violence, she was a beacon of wisdom. Abigail possessed exceptional intelligence, a clear vision of good and evil, and admirable courage to act with grace in adverse circumstances. Her husband, Nabal, was a wealthy man, the owner of vast flocks in the valleys of Carmel, but his character was as deplorable as his fortune was great. Arrogant, reckless, and cruel, he despised those around him and was known for his rudeness. From the start, his marriage to Abigail was unbalanced. While she radiated light and compassion, he was consumed by his own darkness of selfishness and foolishness. Abigail, however, understood that her role was not just that of a wife, but also of a protector of peace in her home. Life with Nabal was not easy. His arrogance led him to reject any advice, even when Abigail's wisdom could have prevented disasters. She, with patience and astuteness, became a tireless mediator, preventing conflicts and protecting her household from her husband's reckless decisions. Her beauty was not superficial. It was a reflection of her integrity. Her heart was full of kindness, and her words had the power to calm storms. Generous with those in need and understanding with the servants, Abigail earned the respect and admiration of those around her. In contrast, Nabal was the antithesis of his wife. His house, though overflowing with riches, lacked warmth and justice. His greed and disdain for others made him despised by many, and his servants often turned to Abigail for help. From the beginning of their marriage, Abigail endured her husband's constant humiliations. Although her heart sometimes filled with sadness, she never allowed bitterness to consume her. Instead, she sought comfort in God and in her mission to preserve peace. One of the first episodes that marked her married life was a celebration in which Nabal, drunk and out of control, insulted an influential neighbor. Abigail, aware of the danger, quickly intervened, apologizing and ensuring the stability of her home with intelligence and diplomacy. This event made it clear that her husband's recklessness was not just a personal problem, but a constant threat to all who depended on him. But Abigail, with the strength that only the truly wise possess, was willing to face any adversity with faith and determination. Despite all the trials she faced, Abigail never allowed resentment to poison her heart. Her inner strength was a reflection of her unwavering faith, an absolute trust that God had a purpose even in the midst of the most adverse circumstances. She believed that through her wisdom and patience, she could navigate the turbulent waters of her marriage and maintain harmony around her. The days passed, and while Nabal sank deeper into his foolishness, Abigail remained a pillar of stability, a woman guided by a greater force that allowed her to face every trial with grace and determination. Without knowing it, her character would be tested like never before, in a moment when her wisdom and courage would prove crucial not only for her family, but for the destiny of a nation. The village of Maon, nestled in the mountainous region of Judah, was a strategic yet inhospitable place. Its steep hills and arid valleys offered natural refuge from invaders, but also demanded a resilient spirit and hard work to survive. To the northeast stretched fertile Carmel, a greener region that served as a vital source of sustenance for its inhabitants. There, Nabal's vast flocks grazed under the supervision of his servants. However, life in these lands was not easy. Resources were limited, and cooperation among neighbors was essential for survival. This fragile stability was often threatened by the arrogance and lack of consideration of men like Nabal. Although he possessed great wealth, his reckless behavior created tensions within the community. In contrast, Abigail was the heart of her home and a bridge of reconciliation in Maon. Known for her diplomacy and sense of justice, she was often called upon to mediate disputes that could have escalated into serious conflicts, if not for her intervention. Nabal's servants, who frequently suffered from his erratic temperament, found in Abigail a fair and reliable leader. It was not uncommon for neighbors, after a long day in the fields or a frustrating encounter with Nabal's obstinacy, to seek her advice or assistance. Her home, though ruled by a surly and selfish man, was a refuge of understanding and fairness. Abigail understood that her position carried great responsibility, and for this reason, she strove to foster relationships based on respect and generosity. The difference between her and Nabal was evident in the way each managed their resources. While he used them to feed his vanity and look down on those he considered inferior, she used them to help those most in need. She knew this could provoke her husband's wrath, but she also understood that doing good was a higher duty. On several occasions, she distributed food and provisions among the hungry, using her cunning to ensure that Nabal did not notice the exact quantities leaving their storerooms. However, not everything could remain hidden. Nabal, with his explosive temper, was involved in numerous conflicts with neighboring shepherds over land and water sources. Abigail, always vigilant, intervened immediately to prevent tensions from spiraling out of control. With soft yet firm words, she managed to calm tempers and demonstrate that, although her husband was a difficult man, she valued peace and cooperation with the community. One of the most critical moments came during a period of drought. With resources stretched thin, desperation grew. Nabal, in his stubbornness, refused to share water from his wells with the neighboring shepherds, despite the fact that they had protected his flocks in the past. Outraged, the men threatened to take the water by force. Upon hearing this, Abigail acted swiftly. As a gesture of goodwill, she brought water skins and provisions, and promised to find a fair solution for both sides. Thanks to her intervention, she prevented a conflict that could have ended in violence. Despite her constant efforts, Abigail knew she could not completely erase the consequences of her husband's actions. In Maon, many openly despised him, and during public gatherings, she often heard biting remarks about him. However, she never responded with anger or disloyalty. Instead of fueling criticism, she redirected the conversation to more productive topics, showing a loyalty that, although incomprehensible to some, reflected her firm commitment to her principles. The weight of these responsibilities was not easy to bear. Every day, Abigail had to deal with the consequences of her husband's decisions, while ensuring the well-being of the servants, maintaining balance in the household, and making sure the community's needs were not neglected. And yet, she never lost her essence. A wise, strong woman guided by the conviction that, even in the most adverse circumstances, the light of justice and kindness could prevail. At night, when the rest of the house was enveloped in the silence of rest, Abigail remained in prayer. seeking God's guidance to face the challenges of the next day. Though Nabal cast a shadow of discord over Maon, she had become a beacon of hope for many. Her presence mitigated the consequences of her husband's recklessness. And though she knew she could not change his heart, she clung to the conviction that her home should not be a source of chaos for others. Life in Maon was a delicate balance, and Abigail walked a tightrope. However, her unwavering faith and wisdom gave her the strength to continue, even when the trials seemed unbearable. Without knowing it, all these experiences were preparing her for a crucial moment, a test that would put her mediation skills and spirit of service to the ultimate test. In the arid hills of the Paran Desert, a group of men lived in constant movement, fleeing from the wrath of a king who considered them enemies. David, the anointed of God but not yet crowned, was forced to escape Saul's relentless pursuit, as the jealous king saw him as a threat to his throne. Despite his status as a fugitive, David was not alone. A band of brave and loyal men had followed him into exile, forming a wandering camp in the harsh lands of Judah. Under the relentless desert sun, with scarce resources and constant dangers, survival was a daily challenge. The days were exhausting, and the nights were cold and filled with uncertainty. Even so, David, with his charisma and leadership, kept the morale of his followers high, as they trusted that the divine purpose would be fulfilled in its time. But survival in such conditions was not easy, and provisions became a constant concern. With a camp of approximately 600 men, access to food and water was an urgent necessity. They relied heavily on the generosity and trade with the shepherds and farmers of the region. David, the man of principles, had established a code of conduct among his men, not to take anything by force nor cause harm to the local inhabitants. This mandate not only ensured his honorable reputation, but also reflected his faith and respect for God's ways. Near Carmel, David's men had established contact with Nabal's shepherds. For months they had protected his flocks from bandits and raiders, ensuring the prosperity of a man whose wealth depended on the safety of his sheep and goats. It was a valuable service, though it had never been requested or compensated. Nabal's shepherds, grateful, spoke of the kindness and respect with which David's men treated them. There was no shortage of stories about how, even on the most dangerous nights, they felt safe knowing that David and his people were watching over them. However, Nabal, blinded by his arrogance, had neither acknowledged nor expressed gratitude for the help he had received. To him, acts of kindness held no weight against his excessive pride. Over time, scarcity became more pressing in David's camp. The changing seasons brought greater difficulties, and their supplies began to run out. Aware of his people's needs, David devised a strategic solution. He recalled Nabal and the protection his men had provided for his flocks. He considered that, in fairness, such a wealthy man could show some generosity and gratitude for the security he had enjoyed at no cost. The season of sheep shearing was approaching, a time of festivity and abundance for the shepherds. During this period, wealthy landowners customarily held great feasts, generously sharing with their workers and those in need. Trusting in this tradition of hospitality and the moral duty of men like Nabal toward those who had benefited them, David decided to send messengers to request provisions. His approach was respectful and prudent. He would not demand anything but would present his request humbly, appealing to Nabal's sense of gratitude and justice. The messengers carried a clear and direct message, reminding Nabal of the protection David's men had provided for his flocks and requesting some sustenance for their camp. It was a reasonable request, especially considering the positive impact David's men had had on Nabal's lands. However, in the desert, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death, Nabal's response would be a test of David's patience and leadership. Through his folly and arrogance, Nabal would prove himself incapable of recognizing the kindness he had received, and his words would set off a conflict that only the wisdom of an exceptional woman could resolve. As David awaited the response of his messengers, he and his men continued to endure with the few resources available. The anticipation in the camp was high, though mixed with unease, for they knew Nabal's reputation. Nevertheless, they trusted that reason and justice would prevail. What they did not know was that they were about to face a situation that would not only put their safety at risk, but also pave the way for an unexpected alliance that would change the course of events. The sun was at its peak when David's messengers arrived at Nabal's lands. They had traveled a dusty and arduous road, but their purpose was clear. They presented themselves respectfully before the servants and asked to speak directly with the master of the estate. When they were brought before Nabal, David's men slightly bowed their heads in deference and began to deliver the message their leader had entrusted to them. "Peace and blessings to you, your house, and all that you possess," they began, following the courtesy and humility with which David had instructed them. They reminded him how David's men had watched over his shepherds and flocks in the past, ensuring that nothing was lacking and that they were not victims of bandits. Then, with respect, they expressed their request, some provisions for their camp, something that, during this time of shearing, was not only reasonable but also honorable. But Nabal was not willing to listen. As the messengers spoke, his expression twisted into a sneer of contempt. To him, everything was measured in wealth and power, and in his eyes, David was nothing more than a worthless fugitive. Accompanied by men, he considered a threat to the established order. "Who is David? And who is the son of Jesse?" he scoffed, raising his voice so that all could hear. "Nowadays, many servants run away from their masters. Am I supposed to take my bread, my water, and the meat I have prepared for my shearers and give it to men? I do not even know where they come from?" His tone was insulting, and his words were deliberately humiliating. He not only rejected the request, but did so in a way that belittled David and mocked his name. The nearby servants exchanged uneasy glances, aware that these words would only bring trouble. But Nabal, blinded by his arrogance, walked away without giving it further thought, leaving David's messengers bewildered and deeply offended. When the messengers returned to the camp, their faces showed more than exhaustion. They carried humiliation and indignation. They recounted to David every word of Nabal's scorn, his arrogant tone, and the way he had insulted not only him but everything he represented. David, who until that moment had endured the trials of his exile with patience and humility, felt anger ignite within him. This was not just a personal affront, it was an outrage against justice, a mockery of the generosity with which his men had protected Nabal's flocks. "Each man strap on your sword," he ordered in a firm and sharp voice, a command that thundered through the camp with unshakable force. There would be no mercy for Nabal's foolishness and insolence. The decision was made. David would march with 400 men, leaving 200 behind to guard the camp. His heart burned with the resolve to take justice into his own hands. The air was thick with tension and determination. The men, loyal to their leader, prepared for battle, though some felt a lingering unease. David, a man known for his faith and righteousness, seemed to be acting out of anger rather than the wisdom that usually guided him. Yet no one dared question him. Nabal's offense was too great. In Nabal's house, the atmosphere was entirely different. Amid the festivities of the sheep shearing, he indulged without a care, oblivious to the imminent danger. But his servants were not so blind. They knew his words would have consequences and feared the worst. One of them, unable to remain idle, decided to seek out Abigail. If anyone could prevent disaster, it was her. "My lady," he said urgently, bowing before her, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, but he scorned them with insults. Those men have been good to us. They never harmed us. On the contrary, they protected us. While they were near, we did not lose a single sheep, but now I fear what may come." Abigail listened intently, her thoughts racing. She knew her husband's temperament and the extent of his foolishness, but this time he had gone too far. David's name echoed throughout Israel. He was not just a warrior, he was the anointed of God, the future king. Provoking him was not just an act of poor judgment, it was a death sentence. Aware of the gravity of the situation, Abigail knew she could not waste time. She could not reason with Nabal, but she could act swiftly to prevent disaster. Without hesitation, she began gathering provisions: bread, wine, dried meat, figs, and raisins, anything that could serve as a peace offering. Abigail was not only a woman of incomparable beauty, but also of intelligence and courage. And now, with every step she took, with every load she prepared, she was heading toward an encounter that would change the course of history. The fate of many depended on her wisdom, and she was ready to face it. Without wasting a moment, Abigail made an unshakable decision. She knew she could not count on Nabal to amend the offense. Any attempt to reason with him would be as futile as casting words into the wind. Her discernment told her that she had to act on her own, swiftly and wisely, to prevent a disaster that could stain her home with blood. With the composure of one who understands the urgency of the moment, Abigail ordered her servants to gather a generous offering for David and his men. She spared nothing: freshly baked bread, wineskins brimming with wine, tender and well-seasoned meat, pressed figs and dried dates. Everything was meticulously prepared, ensuring that each provision represented a gesture of reconciliation and respect. As she oversaw the preparations, Abigail carefully pondered the words she would speak to David. She knew that the success of her mission depended not only on material gifts, but also on her ability to appeal to his heart. Her speech needed to be persuasive, humble, yet firm, because she was about to face a man enraged and wounded in his honor. The servants, accustomed to her prudent and decisive leadership, hurried to fulfill her every command. Within hours, the donkeys were loaded and ready for the journey. Without hesitation, Abigail set out for the encounter that would determine the fate of her household. She knew that time was crucial, and that the only way to prevent catastrophe was to reach David before he arrived at Nabal. But she also knew something deeper. Her trust was not in her own ability, but in the God who guides the steps of those who act with wisdom and righteousness. Before departing, she gave strict instructions that no one was to inform Nabal of what she was doing. She had no doubt that her husband, dominated by arrogance and pride, would attempt to thwart her efforts at reconciliation. So, with firm resolve, she chose to proceed in secret, convinced that her actions would not only preserve lives, but also honor the Lord by preventing unnecessary bloodshed. The road to the wilderness was long and dusty. As Abigail advanced with her group of servants leading the loaded animals, her heart pounded intensely. But it was not fear that governed her. It was the certainty that she was about to face a trial that would demand all her courage. The sky darkened as the torches of David's men began to glow in the distance. The moment was approaching. Abigail knew that every minute counted, and that she had to arrive before David's anger turned into an irreversible action. At last, she saw the silhouettes of the warriors drawing near. She gracefully dismounted from her donkey, took a deep breath, and adjusted her mantle. She was ready. In a matter of moments, she would stand face to face with the man whose destiny was marked by divine promise, a righteous man, but now blinded by indignation. Night had fully fallen when Abigail met David and his men. The flickering torchlight illuminated their stern and resolute faces. They marched forward with determined steps, swords at the ready, driven by the fury of the insult they had received. David, leading the group, radiated authority. Nabal's offense had not only been a personal insult but an outrage against the dignity of his men. His resolve was clear. The foolishness of one man would not go unpunished. When Abigail saw them approaching, she instructed her servants to bring forward the provisions. Then, with grace, she stepped down and walked toward David with humility. As she stood before him, she bowed deeply, a gesture of sincere and deliberate respect. Her posture not only conveyed deference, but also sought to calm the storm raging in the warrior's heart. David halted, surprised by the scene. He had not expected to find a woman in his path, much less one who, with such dignity and courage, dared to stand in the way of his march for justice. In that instant, destiny paused for a moment. Abigail's decision would not only determine the outcome of that night, but also leave an indelible mark on the history of Israel. Before he could utter a word, Abigail slightly lifted her gaze, her expression serene yet resolute. With a subtle bow, she began to speak in a firm voice, though one imbued with humility. "My lord," she said, and her tone reverberated in the stillness of the night, "I beg you to listen to your servant. Do not let the actions of my husband Nabal fill you with indignation. As his name suggests, he is a fool. His heart is senseless, and his conduct is unworthy. But I, your servant, did not know about the messengers you sent. Had I known, I would have acted sooner to prevent this offense." She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink into the hearts of David and his men. Then, with a delicate gesture, she pointed to the provisions her servants had brought. "I have brought this gift for you and for the men who accompany you. I plead with you to accept this offering and to forgive the fault of your servant and my husband. But more than that, I implore you not to let anger lead you to shed innocent blood or to take vengeance by your own hand. The Lord your God is the one who fights your battles, and he himself will grant you victory." David, who until that moment had been consumed by fury, began to listen attentively. Abigail's words were not just a plea, they were a reminder of the divine purpose in his life. She continued, her voice now filled with unshakable faith and a prophetic vision of the destiny that awaited David. "The Lord will surely build for you a lasting house because you fight the battles of the Lord, and there is no evil in you. Even if someone seeks your life, your soul will be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God, while the lives of your enemies will be flung away like a stone from a sling. And when the Lord has fulfilled all the good he has promised you and has made you ruler over Israel, you will not want this act of vengeance to weigh on your conscience. You will not bear the burden of having shed blood without cause or of having avenged yourself with your own hand." Abigail's wisdom and eloquence were undeniable. David, a man who knew how to recognize the voice of God even in the midst of adversity, felt the consuming anger within him gradually dissipate. The vision she had painted a future in which he would reign without the shadow of guilt or rash decisions deeply moved him. Finally, David spoke. His tone, though still tinged with astonishment, was now much calmer. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. And blessed are you for your wisdom and good judgment, for you have kept me from shedding blood this day and from taking vengeance with my own hand. If not for you, not one male in Nabal's household would have been left alive by morning." With these words, David accepted Abigail's gift and assured her that he would not carry out the attack he had planned. He acknowledged that God had used this extraordinary woman to prevent him from making a grave mistake. David's men, who had remained silent until then, also seemed to relax, understanding that the course of events had changed for the better. Abigail, with one last bow, thanked David for his willingness to listen. Then, with the same grace and wisdom with which she had arrived, she bid farewell and set out on her journey home. As Abigail departed, David and his men remained in silence, reflecting on what had just occurred. They had not only witnessed the wisdom and courage of this woman, but had also seen the hand of God working at the precise moment to guide their steps. For David, this encounter was a powerful reminder of the importance of trusting in divine justice and not being led by anger. For Abigail, it was the confirmation that wisdom, courage, and faith could change even the darkest destinies. Unbeknownst to them, their paths had begun to intertwine in a story that would transcend time. With the first light of dawn, Abigail returned home. Her steps were light with the peace she had managed to preserve, and her heart was full of gratitude. Though the night had been tense and challenging, she now felt the comfort of knowing that her intervention had saved her family and community from imminent disaster. The servants who accompanied her reflected the same relief on their faces. They knew that their mistress's wisdom had changed the fate of them all. Upon her arrival, the atmosphere of her home starkly contrasted with the gravity of what had just transpired. The courtyard was filled with laughter, music, and loud voices. Nabal, completely oblivious to the crisis that had nearly touched his life, had organized a feast as if he were a king. The tables overflowed with food and wine, and the guests, just as drunk as their host, celebrated with an almost absurd recklessness. Abigail contemplated the scene in silence. There was Nabal, seated at the center, his face flushed from excessive wine, laughing and shouting uncontrollably. Everything about his demeanor reflected his foolishness, the lack of moderation, the unnecessary ostentation, and the disregard for anything beyond his own pleasure. For a moment, Abigail felt a deep weariness. She had risked everything to save a man who was not even aware of the danger he had been in. But she knew that speaking to him in his state of drunkenness would be useless. Wisdom dictated that the confrontation would have to wait. So, with the same serenity that characterized her, she withdrew to her room, letting the night and Nabal's excesses run their course. She spent the remaining hours in prayer, asking for strength and guidance for what was to come. When the sun rose and the lights of the feast faded, Nabal awoke with the hangover evident on his face. The house was silent, the guests had left, and the disorder from the banquet was the only remnant of the previous night. It was then that Abigail, her face serene but determined, approached him. It was time to speak. "I must tell you something important," she began, her tone calm but full of intent. "Last night, while you were celebrating, David and his men were coming toward us with the intention of destroying our house and everything we own." Nabal looked at her in confusion at first, but as Abigail continued speaking, his expression began to change. She recounted how David had sent messengers in peace, and how he had humiliated them. She explained the danger his foolishness had brought upon their family, and how she had to intervene to save them. With each word, Nabal's face grew paler, his body tensed, as if the truth had struck him with relentless force. The impact was so profound that he remained motionless, his breath short, his eyes wide with shock. He could not utter a word. It was as if life itself had been extinguished within him. Abigail watched as her husband, unable to process what he had just heard, became trapped in a state of paralysis. His heart, weakened by excess and accumulated tension, could not withstand the blow. Nabal fell into a state resembling a coma. His body was present, but his mind and spirit seemed absent. The servants rushed to help him, trying to revive him, but it was all in vain. The man who had lived with arrogance and contempt for others now lay helpless, completely vulnerable, a victim of his own foolishness. In the days that followed, Abigail cared for him with the same diligence, with which she had always fulfilled her duties. But she knew that Nabal's fate was now in God's hands. 10 days later, Nabal died, leaving behind a legacy of foolishness and selfishness. However, for Abigail, his death was not a cause for celebration, but a solemn reminder of the power of divine justice. Though the household was shaken by the loss of its master, the servants and the community recognized Abigail's wisdom and courage. She had saved them all from ruin and demonstrated that true strength does not lie in physical power or wealth, but in the ability to act with prudence, humility, and trust in God. Her name from that moment on would be remembered not only for her actions, but for the exceptional character she had displayed in the midst of adversity. The air in Maon grew heavy, laden with solemnity. News of Nabal's death spread quickly among the neighbors and servants, leaving behind a mixture of astonishment and reflection. The man known for his wealth and harsh temperament had died suddenly, not by the sword of an enemy, nor by the hands of an attacker, but by the weight of his own decisions. The community, which had endured his temper and arrogance for years, perceived his death as an act of divine judgment, a testament to God's power to correct the foolish and exalt His justice through the most unexpected circumstances. For Abigail, Nabal's death was neither a source of joy nor vengeance. Though she had endured years of disdain and hardship because of her husband, her heart was filled with reverence and awe toward the God who had intervened so decisively. From the moment Nabal fell ill, Abigail had prayed for God's will, leaving her husband's fate in his hands. When he finally died, she accepted it not as an accident nor a mere human outcome, but as a manifestation of divine justice that transcended her own understanding. The community began to reflect on the message that this death carried. Nabal, despite his wealth and power, had fallen because of his pride and his contempt for others, especially for David, the man whom God had anointed as the future king. For many, his death was a reminder that neither social status nor possessions could protect a person from God's judgment when acting with arrogance and foolishness. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, some recalled, quoting the words that resonated in the teachings of Israel. Nabal had lacked that fear, relying solely on his wealth and his own understanding. The lesson was clear: God does not tolerate pride, and though His justice may seem delayed, it is inevitable. Abigail, for her part, was recognized as an instrument of that divine justice. Her intervention had prevented David and his men from shedding unnecessary blood, thus preserving his integrity and his future as the leader of Israel. Moreover, her willingness to act quickly and wisely in a dangerous situation had saved her family and the entire community from a greater tragedy. The servants, the neighbors, and even shepherds from other regions began to speak of Abigail, not only as a beautiful and wise woman, but as someone whose faith and discernment had been used by God to fulfill His purpose. In the silence of her home, now more peaceful without Nabal's presence, Abigail reflected on everything that had happened. She recalled David's words when he blessed her for intervening. "Blessed are you for your good judgment and for keeping me from shedding blood today." These words resonated in her mind as a testimony that she had acted rightly, not for her own benefit, but to honor God and protect the lives of the innocent. Nabal's death also marked a new beginning. For the first time in years, Abigail felt that the burden of her husband's foolishness and selfishness had been lifted from her shoulders. However, far from rejoicing in his absence, she devoted herself to organizing the household with justice and mercy, ensuring that the servants and shepherds who had worked under Nabal's shadow now experienced leadership filled with integrity. The divine judgment against Nabal was not only an act of correction, but also a reminder that God does not ignore the suffering of the righteous. Abigail, who had patiently endured years of humiliation and hardship, had been vindicated in a way that only God could orchestrate. Her story was not only a warning for the foolish and the arrogant, but also a testimony that those who trust in God and act with wisdom and faith will be exalted in due time. In the days that followed, as the servants reorganized the household and the neighbors offered words of comfort and respect, Abigail felt a deep peace within her. She knew that her life had been preserved for a greater purpose, and though she did not yet fully understand what the future held, she trusted that the same God who had guided her thus far would continue to work through her. God's justice had not only brought judgment upon Nabal, but had also opened a new opportunity for Abigail. Her days of suffering and trial had been transformed into a living testimony of divine power and wisdom, a story that would be told for generations as proof that pride precedes a fall, but humility and faith are always rewarded in the perfect time of the Lord. The news of Nabal's death quickly reached David, who was still in the wilderness with his men. The messengers recounted how after 10 days of illness, Nabal's life had suddenly come to an end. Upon hearing this, David reflected deeply on the recent events and recognized the hand of God in every detail. "Blessed be the Lord," he proclaimed firmly for all to hear, "who has executed justice for my insult at the hands of Nabal, and has kept his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned Nabal's own iniquity upon his head." For David, Nabal's death not only marked the end of a potential adversary, but also confirmed that God was working in his favor, directing his steps and protecting the purpose he had for his life. Then, his thoughts returned to Abigail, the woman whose wisdom and humility had prevented unnecessary bloodshed. Her image remained vivid in his memory. The nobility of her heart, her discernment in the midst of danger, and her courage to intercede for her family and community. David understood that Abigail was not just a beautiful woman, but a valuable ally, someone who could walk beside him on the challenging path ahead. Determined, he sent a group of messengers to Maon with a marriage proposal for her. This request was not born out of impulse or mere superficial interest, but was a genuine recognition of Abigail's character and the way God had used her as an instrument of his justice. The messengers arrived at Abigail's house and were received with kindness and respect. As they delivered David's message, they spoke with reverence, emphasizing how their Lord regarded her as a woman of unmatched virtue and wisdom. "David, our Lord, has sent us to speak with you," they said. "He desires you to become his wife, for he has seen in you a character that honors God." Upon hearing the proposal, Abigail remained silent for a moment, surprised. Although she knew that David had spoken well of her after their encounter, she had not expected such a significant and honorable request. However, as she pondered it, she realized that this was not merely a step in her personal life, but part of a greater divine plan. With humility, she rose, bowed her head, and responded, "Here is your servant, ready to wash the feet of my Lord's servants." Her response, though simple, reflected the nobility of her heart, modesty, gratitude, and a genuine willingness to serve. For Abigail, this union was not an opportunity to exalt herself, but a calling to continue being an instrument in God's hands. Without delay, Abigail prepared to leave with David's messengers. She gave clear instructions to ensure her household would continue functioning in her absence. But in her heart, she knew her life was taking an entirely new direction. Without fear, she trusted that the same God who had guided her thus far would continue to direct her steps. When she arrived at David's camp, she was received with respect and admiration. David, upon seeing her, could not help but remember the first time he met her, the way she had faced his men with courage, the wisdom with which she had spoken, and the peace she had brought in a moment of tension. Now, free from the burden of her marriage to Nabal, Abigail radiated an even deeper serenity. "Blessed be the Lord who has guided you to me," David said sincerely. "You will be for me not only a wife, but also a companion on this path that God has set before us." With these words, David and Abigail joined their lives. Their marriage was not the result of a mere coincidence, but a demonstration of God's power to orchestrate every detail in fulfillment of His will. Abigail, who had been a beacon of wisdom and faith in the midst of foolishness, now found a place of honor beside the man who would become king of Israel. But beyond titles and positions, she knew that her true purpose had not changed: to continue being an instrument of justice, peace, and divine will in every step of her life. Abigail's life changed radically when she became David's wife. From the relative stability of her home in Maon, she became part of an environment of constant movement, challenges, and dangers. David, though anointed by God as the future king of Israel, still lived as a fugitive, fleeing Saul's persecution and facing the hardships of leading a group of men in the wilderness. Abigail, accustomed to managing the tensions of her former household, now found herself in a new reality, where strategy, politics, and faith were essential. From the moment she arrived at the camp, she embraced her position with dignity. She knew that life with David would not be easy, but she also understood that she was part of God's purpose. Her presence did not go unnoticed by David's men, who saw her not only as his wife, but also as a source of wisdom and serenity. Despite the difficulties, Abigail adapted quickly, providing support to David and earning the respect of everyone. The camp was constantly tense. Saul's threat, the scarcity of resources, and the uncertainty of the future loomed over them. However, Abigail did not remain a mere spectator. She actively engaged, listening, encouraging, and calming tempers when necessary. Her ability to mediate, developed during her life with Nabal, became an invaluable asset. Moreover, Abigail faced the reality of sharing her husband with other women, such as Ahinoam of Jezreel. Though this situation could have provoked jealousy and rivalries, she remained steadfast in her humility and wisdom. Instead of focusing on potential conflicts, she chose to fulfill her purpose with grace, trusting that God would provide her with the guidance she needed. In moments of solitude, Abigail reflected on the transformation she had undergone. From being the wife of a foolish and arrogant man, she had become the partner of a leader anointed by God. But she understood that this new role did not only bring privileges, but also great responsibilities. It was not a place of comfort, but a calling to serve. She knew that David carried the weight of leadership on his shoulders, and that, as his wife, she had to be an unwavering support. In her prayers, she asked for strength and discernment to face the challenges of her new life. Over time, Abigail became a trusted advisor to David. Her wisdom and discernment made her invaluable in crucial moments. When an internal dispute arose in the camp, some men, weary of scarcity, began questioning David's leadership. Aware of the danger of division, Abigail spoke with him and encouraged him to restore trust and unity among his followers. Thanks to her prudent words, David managed to handle the situation wisely, preventing a greater conflict. Beyond being his advisor, Abigail provided David with a space of peace amid the chaos. Their conversations, filled with faith and reflection, reminded him that his destiny did not depend on circumstances, but on God's promise. She encouraged him to maintain his faith and trust that God would fulfill His plan at the right time. For Abigail, life alongside David was not just a transitional phase, but the fulfillment of a divine purpose. She understood that her role was not a privilege for her own benefit, but a sacred responsibility. Through her words, actions, and prayers, she sought to strengthen David and contribute to God's plan for Israel. Though challenges were constant, Abigail remained steadfast, trusting that God had placed her exactly where she needed to be. Her wisdom, patience, and faith not only made her the ideal companion for David, but also an example to all who surrounded her. The woman who had once faced a future king with humility and courage now walked beside him, playing a crucial role in a story that would change the destiny of a nation. Life with David was not without challenges, even after he ascended to the throne of Israel. Though God's promise had been fulfilled, and David now ruled as king, tensions within and outside the kingdom remained constant. Political conflicts, internal disputes, and power struggles among the tribes required firm leadership and often difficult decisions. Amid it all, Abigail continued to be a figure of wisdom and balance, offering her counsel with a blend of prudence and faith. In David's inner circle, where advisors, warriors, and members of the royal family coexisted, tensions were often inevitable. Political and military decisions, along with rivalries among David's wives and children, created conflicts that threatened to destabilize the court. Known for her peaceful and thoughtful nature, Abigail became a crucial mediator. On one occasion, a dispute arose between Joab, David's army commander, and other military leaders over the strategy for a campaign against a rebel group. As voices rose and opinions diverged, Abigail intervened with an observation that changed the course of the conversation. A leader must not only win the war but also preserve the unity of those who fight alongside him, she said calmly. Her comment, though brief, made the men reconsider their approach and seek a consensus that would strengthen the group rather than divide it. When David learned of Abigail's intervention, he expressed his gratitude. "Your wisdom," he said to her, "is like a deep well from which we can all drink. Your words bring peace, even in the most tense moments." These words reflected not only David's personal appreciation, but also Abigail's growing influence on relationships within the court. Beyond political conflicts, Abigail played a key role in the personal lives of those around David. Her interactions with others were marked by empathy and understanding, qualities that made her approachable to those seeking counsel. David's wives, many of whom struggled with the rivalries inherent in their situation, often turned to Abigail for guidance. For example, when tensions arose between Ahinoam and Bathsheba over their children, Abigail intervened tactfully. Instead of taking sides, she encouraged them to reflect on the impact of their conflicts on the unity of the kingdom and the hearts of their sons. "The sons of a king must learn from their mothers how to rule with wisdom," she told them. "Our example is the greatest lesson they can receive." Though rivalries did not disappear entirely, Abigail's conciliatory approach helped ease tensions. She also had a notable influence on David's children. Absalom, known for his strong temperament and ambition, often listened to Abigail with respect. Though she could not prevent the reckless decisions he would later make, her relationship with him was a testament to her ability to connect even with the most complicated hearts. Amid all these responsibilities, Abigail took time to reflect on her life and God's plan. Often, as the days passed in the court or during quiet nights in the palace, she would look up at the starry sky and remember the path that had brought her there. The young woman who had once lived under the weight of Nabal's foolishness now walked beside a king, serving her people and her God with all her heart. Abigail understood that every stage of her life had been part of a greater purpose. Her years with Nabal, though filled with hardships, had prepared her to be a woman of strength and discernment. Her encounter with David, which had begun as a desperate act to save her home, had transformed into a new chapter full of meaning. And now, on the throne of Israel, she continued to see God's hand guiding every step. "I do not understand all the ways of the Lord," she thought in her moments of prayer, "but I know they are good. He has led me through dark valleys and high peaks, and in every place I have learned to trust Him more deeply." These reflections not only strengthened her faith but also helped her maintain the right perspective amid conflicts. Abigail's wisdom, nourished by her faith and experience, not only helped David and his inner circle, but also left a lasting mark on the kingdom. Her ability to act with prudence, speak with truth, and love with compassion made her an example to those around her. Even those who did not share her faith recognized that her life was a testimony of a greater force working through her. Abigail understood that her time in this world was fleeting, but she trusted that the seeds she planted through her service and wisdom would bear fruit in future generations. Her life was a living testimony that even in the midst of the most challenging conflicts, faith and prudence could bring peace, justice, and purpose. And so, at the heart of David's reign, Abigail remained a beacon of hope, a faithful advisor, and a woman whose character reflected the essence of God's heart. Her legacy was not limited to her time. Her example of wisdom, humility, and faith continues to resonate through the centuries. Though the biblical accounts of her are brief, her impact was evident in the decisions she influenced, the lives she protected, and the way her existence reflected the attributes of a heart devoted to God. In the twilight of her life, Abigail immersed herself in deep reflections on the path God had allowed her to walk. From the dark days with Nabal to the crucial moments beside David, she could see how each chapter of her story had been shaped by the Creator's hand with a greater purpose. Her life was not marked by a pursuit of glory or power, but by sacrifice, service, and an unshakable faith that sustained her through every trial. "The Lord guided me through every shadow and every light," she meditated as she gazed at the horizon from her dwelling. "Nothing I lived was in vain, for in all things He fulfilled His plan." These words were not just a personal affirmation, but a universal truth that resonated in the lives of those touched by her influence. Abigail's impact transcended her time with David and her role in the royal court. Her intervention at a critical moment, when anger and impulsivity threatened to cloud David's judgment, not only saved lives but also helped preserve the conscience of Israel's future king. This seemingly simple act had profound consequences in the history of God's people. Abigail became a model of what it means to be an instrument of divine justice. Her humility, discernment, and unwavering trust in God positioned her as one of the most admirable figures in Scripture. Her story demonstrates that even in the most adverse circumstances, it is possible to live with purpose and honor God in every action. The secret of Abigail did not lie in her beauty or intelligence, but in her deep relationship with the Creator. Every word she spoke and every decision she made was guided by her conviction that God was in control and that His will was always perfect. This faith not only strengthened her in difficult moments, but also allowed her to act with clarity and justice. Abigail did not seek her own glory nor act out of self-interest. Her motivation was to honor God and protect those under her influence. This commitment transformed her into an instrument of peace and justice, and her story remains a living testimony to the transformative power of a life surrendered to God. Though her days on earth came to an end, her legacy remains. Her life is an eternal reminder that wisdom, humility, and faith can change even the most challenging situations. For those who face difficulties, conflicts, or uncertainties today, Abigail's story serves as a guide on how to live with purpose and confidence, knowing that God is present in every step of the journey. And so Abigail, the woman who saved her home with wise words, who walked alongside the King of Israel, and who dedicated her life to service with humility and faith, continues to inspire generations. Her story reminds us that when our actions are guided by God, we have the power to transform lives and leave an eternal impact. I hope that this story of Abigail, a woman of wisdom, humility, and unshakable faith, has inspired you as much as it has inspired us in telling her life. It is a testament that trusting in God, acting with discernment, and living with humility can turn even the most difficult moments into witnesses of His grace and power. If you enjoyed this narration, I invite you to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content. Leave us your comments on which part of the story impacted you the most, or if there are other biblical stories you would like to learn about. Share this video with your friends and loved ones, so they too can discover the life and legacy of Abigail. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next video.